So now we're going to talk about red blood cells, right? So when you hear the word red blood cell, what is the first thing you think about what the actual function is? So red blood cells' main function is to carry oxygen to the tissues, right? So their main function is to carry oxygen in the tissues, right? So the development begins, so if I were to draw, for example, here, this is a little bone, right? In the marrow here, you have these specialized type of cells. These are called hematopoietic stem cells. Hematopoietic stem cells give rise to all the blood types, right? Blood cells. So red blood cells, white blood cells, cell fragments like platelets, right? And so they differentiate to erythrocytes. So erythrocytes is another way of saying red blood cells, right? Through the process called erythropoiesis. So if I were to write here, so erythropoiesis. So this is the actual development, this differentiation process of hematopoietic stem cells to become terminally differentiated into these erythrocytes, also known as red blood cells. Right, and so we said the main function of red blood cells is to carry oxygen, right, to the tissues. All right. So now you have this development that takes place. What else about the red blood cell? So if you notice about the actual red blood cells structure, they have this little biconcave nature. And so as we said originally from its original function, red blood cells' main function is to carry oxygen. This biconcave structure increases the surface area, allowing for the increased permeability and the increased diffusion of these oxygen molecules that go in, right? So you have all these oxygens going in very nicely, right? There are certain pathological conditions like, for example, sickle cell anemia, where there's an abnormality of this biconcave structure, right? And this causes a lack of actual diffusion into the red blood cells, right? Red blood cells also, when we look at them metabolically, right? They are the only cell in the body that do not have any membrane-bound organelles. So no membrane-bound organelles, right? What does that mean? What is an organelle? Organelle is like, for example, the mitochondria, the nucleus, what else? The endoplasmic reticulum, the Golgi apparatus. Red blood cells do not have that, right? So how do they produce energy, right? So if you remember from before, the way you produce energy is through what? Mitochondria, right? Mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell. It produces all the ATP, that specific energy that's required to make any kind of cell physiology possible, right? But red blood cells don't have it. So how do they do it? So they take advantage of this other metabolic passageway called glycolysis. So what is glycolysis? This is the breakdown of sugar. So they break down one sugar to generate two ATPs in order to, for example, if they need any kind of mobility or migration, they do it with the process of glycolysis. All right? And so generally, again, we're starting from how they develop, the actual mechanism, the actual structure, their metabolism, and now let's look at the actual function. So if I were to draw a red blood cell here, right? It is composed with an abundance of these little globular proteins we call hemoglobin, right? So hemoglobin is this globular protein. So you see this globular protein that's present that has a high affinity to oxygen. What gives us this high affinity? It's the heme region. So the heme region is composed of these iron groups. These iron groups here that are of a positive charge attracts all of the oxygen, again, that have a slightly negative charge, right? So they have a partial negative charge that causes this attraction, right? So you have this attraction that takes place in the red blood cells, right? And this attraction leads for the oxygen to bind. When one oxygen binds to this hemoglobin, there is a change in configuration of the globular protein. That process is called cooperativity. So cooperativity, instances of cooperativity, leads to this configuration which allows for an increase in affinity for oxygen. So the affinity increases, so now the oxygen can bind very easily, right? And so when we talk about all this, in the end, the last thing I really want to talk about is this process of erythropoiesis, right? So back here, when we said that hematopoietic stem cells combine with the erythrocytes in order, differentiate into the erythrocytes through the process of erythropoiesis. So the chemicals that are really important so far that we know, one is iron, right? Because it needs iron. Okay. What else it needs? It needs amino acids in order to generate the globular proteins. It also needs specific vitamins too. So B12 and different other vitamins like folic acid, different vitamins that allows for the development. And there's also one other hormone that it requires in order for this process to happen. And this is called EPO, erythropoietin. Erythropoietin is secreted by your kidneys. So if this is the kidney, here. Kidneys during instances of anemia, right? So when you have low red blood cell count, all right? So instances of low hemoglobin, some kind of autoimmunity, some kind of hemolytic anemia. The body secretes EPO from the kidneys. So kidneys secrete EPO, and EPO is the final product that is required for this process of erythropoiesis to take place, right? So a lot of athletes, what do? They don't want to actually be an honorable athlete, right? So what do? It's that they thought, let me find instances where I can take advantage of this mechanism. And so if you ever hear about the word doping, blood doping, right? Blood doping is injection of synthetic erythropoietin, right? So this leads to an increase in blood sugar. Red blood cell count. So this leads to an increase in red blood cell. Excuse me for that last part. All right. Increase in red blood cell causes an increase in carrying capacity of these oxygen to the tissues, right? And so this leads to an enhancement of performance, right? But this problem can lead to other pathological condition. It's called Polycythemia Vera. Polycythemia Vera. Cythemia, excuse my spelling, Vera, where this leads to an increase in blood viscosity, right, due to the abnormal levels of red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, right? And this can lead to instances of ischemic problems because the blood doesn't actually flow normally, right? So other ways of triggering EPO release would be, for example, instances of hypoxia. So hypoxia can lead to increase in EPO release, right? So low oxygen, so high altitude trainers, whenever they go into the mountains and train, somewhere in like Denver or Colorado, right? Other reasons of ways of increasing EPO is the decrease in hemoglobin, right? So lack of iron, lack of globular proteins, and also finally, the lack of red blood cells, right? So these are the main ways of increasing erythropoietin naturally. I'm not saying go and destroy all your red blood cells and to increase EPO through some kind of sports related injury. I have no idea, right? So a lot of other kinds of anemias can occur, but the best way a lot of athletes do now is they go into high altitude training. So they go out into these high mountains, right? And you have, in these high altitudes, you have very low partial pressure of oxygen, okay? That low partial pressure of oxygen leads to instances of hypoxia, which causes EPO to be released in your body naturally.